China releases a new report to share its experience eliminating extreme poverty. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. In a white paper issued on Tuesday, China details its experience and contributions to poverty alleviation. To date, China has lifted hundreds of millions of people, many living in rural areas, out of extreme poverty. As Liu Gan reports, Beijing hopes to share its accomplishments with the global community.
8 years, 98 million people, 128,000 villages, and over 800 designated counties, all out of poverty. That's what China has achieved, as recorded in its new white paper.
China's poverty reduction experience shows that poverty is not destined and invincible.
Along with an increase in incomes and improvements to infrastructure, officials say they're also seeing a new mindset in the people who've been lifted from extreme hardship. Many of them have learned new skills and new ways of making a living. Officials say this has broadened their perspective. They also say it's laid the foundations for the government to further prioritize rural development.
China will continue to consolidate and expand its achievements in poverty alleviation and promote rural revitalization across the country with more effective measures and stronger force.
By 2035, officials say rural areas will enjoy the same basic public services as urban areas. They say there will be fundamental improvements to the ecological environment, and they believe this will bring about a more beautiful and livable countryside. The paper concluded with China's aim to build a global community with a shared future. That means in the future, China will exchange more with other countries and contribute more to the global community. Li Gan, CGTN, Beijing.
For more now on China's poverty alleviation, let's bring in our panel. Joining us from Beijing is Einar Tangen. He's a political and economic affairs commentator. Also with us from Portland, Oregon is Liang. She's a professor of economics at Willamette University. From Boston, Jorge Heine is a research professor with Boston University and the former Chilean Ambassador to China. And Li Gan is a professor of economics at Texas A&M University in College Park, Texas. Thanks, everyone, for being with us. Li Gan, let me start with you. China has been able to lift hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. It's a signature achievement, not accomplished by any other country in the world, developed or developing. And it now has the blueprint. It knows how to do it, and it wants to share this with the rest of the world. So give us your assessment of how significant this achievement is in a country of 1.4 billion people.
So I think this is pretty amazing. 100 million people eliminated from the extreme poverty roughly in 10-year period. So this has never been, as you said, this has never been done in world history. So no matter what's, in terms of scale, in terms of the achievement, I think no matter how you say it, this is pretty amazing, historical, I would say.
Einar Tangen, if we look at this achievement all over China, we see that in China's 5 autonomous regions, including the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, the impoverished part of the population dropped by 15.6 million people. One of the other major achievements was that the Chinese authorities were able to provide electric power to almost all Chinese people in the country. So what is your view on this? How important is this achievement?
Well, it's very important to China, which is a socialist country. I mean, they put their socialist goals first. They use the market as a tool to achieve them in terms of efficiency. But a lot of it is about what your priorities are. I mean, in the U.S., we are spending 1.7 trillion US dollars on one F-35 airplane development, fighter jet. China's going to spend approximately the same amount on the Belt and Road Initiative. And this is the same thing with poverty reduction. They spend tens of billions of dollars to achieve this. It was not easy, especially during a pandemic year, but they just pushed ahead with it because it was important. And especially in these autonomous regions where you had a lot of kind of ingrained poverty, poor areas where people from minority nations had been pushed over time, it needed attention, and that's what they have been doing. It's not only poverty reduction in terms of giving aid, but it's also about education, making sure people have the tools to actually create something for themselves. Government is not doing everything. They expect the individual to meet them halfway.
Liang, what kind of impact will this have on the broader Chinese economy? You know, we know it's a country right now which is in the middle of a transition. It's transitioning from just purely a manufacturing country to one that would look at its services sector, for instance, or increasing consumer demand. So when we look at this achievement of increasing the number of people who are being brought out of poverty, what impact does it have?
Thank you for having me on, Anna. So I think that's a very important question. I agree with what Tangen was just talked about, that this kind of shared prosperity is part of the socialism goal. So eradicating poverty is an angle of itself, but it is also a very important means to kind of propel China to continue to grow and, you know, escape the so-called middle income trap, to rely more on domestic demand. So far, you know, we know that there are still about 40% of the Chinese population live in the rural area. So by providing a lot of social services and upgrade infrastructure, creating jobs and modernizing the agriculture sector, this provides very important income growth momentum to the large proportion of the population. And so that definitely would boost domestic demand. As you just mentioned, the consumption demand will be improved because of these kinds of rural revitalization initiative. So I do think, you know, poverty eradication and continued income growth for rural population is very important as both a means and an end to itself.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, you know, as we've been saying, China has successfully brought hundreds of millions of people out of poverty, lifted them out of poverty, and is now saying to the world, look, we've got the roadmap, we know how this is done, and we can share this with you. We can help other countries lift their people out of poverty as well. But, you know, as we are aware, you know, one template doesn't fit everybody. So to what extent can those policies that China formulated and implemented be emulated in other countries?
Well, I think that's a great question. I mean, the number one lesson I draw from what I see, which is so remarkable, is that in the end, the key to it is development. I mean, the best program for poverty alleviation is to grow at 10% a year for 30 years in a row, which is what China has done. Now, that is not something can be easily emulated, but there are other aspects that can. And one of them, it seems to me, is the targeting of those people in those areas that somehow fall through the crack of development. And it seems to me China has done that very well. And the key here, I was struck by the document that came out today, how it emphasized the shift from an emphasis on sort of the external input into situations marked by poverty towards the sort of internal motivation of people to lift themselves up by their bootstraps. You know, a child can be very highly motivated, but if he or she doesn't have a laptop or Wi-Fi connectivity at the time of the pandemic, you know, he or she will be just out of luck. So it seems to me what the Chinese government has done is to provide people with the right tools, with the right instruments they need to lift themselves out of poverty. And that, it seems to me, is the key to successful poverty eradication.
And Ambassador, I'm presuming that to get something like this done, you would have to have the consent of the people. You'd all have to be pulling in the same direction.
Yes, of course. I mean, the key point here, it seems to me, is, and I think the message here is central, about the fact that it is people themselves that pull themselves out of poverty. Now, what government policies can do is to provide them with whatever they need in terms of instruments, in terms of connectivity. I would stress infrastructure. In today's world, digital connectivity, Wi-Fi and so on, that can provide, say, rural villages in China with access to e-commerce and otherwise connect with China and with the rest of the world. Today, the smartphone is a very powerful tool, and China, it seems to me, shows us that can be extremely helpful to fight poverty.
Li Gan, what in your view were the most difficult issues or challenges that China faced in getting to where it is today?
I think, as Ambassador said, China has done a lot in terms of motivating poor people to work hard, to be out of the poverty themselves. This is also, they've done something quite successfully, but this also remains the biggest challenge for China to continue helping the poor. I think there are two things going on here. First of all, I would say the internal motivation has to be accompanied by whether the work can really generate enough of the output and help themselves. Many of the poor areas, you mentioned like minority area and the mountainous area, that the infrastructure is bad, environment is very, very bad. So you work very hard, you may not even generate sufficient output for yourself. So I think China has done a lot in terms of helping those areas. Many people mention infrastructures, basic service, all kinds of things. They spend a lot of money to make the environment somewhat more productive, the farmland more productive. That they have done fantastically for last 5-10 years. But still, this still remains the largest challenge for next 5 years, for next 10 years or 15 years. Talk about 2035. I would say that's still the biggest problem. China actually I want to add one thing. There's also, I mean, China's experience worth many countries maybe learn from them, but China also learned a lot from other countries as well during this anti-poverty process, the last 5-10 years. One thing they've done, which I participated quite a bit, is they learned quite a bit from we call like in the United States, we call the earned income tax credit type of programs. So people work, they actually get money, get government subsidy. You work more, you get more, and that type of program, which has some experiment in China, has been quite successful. So yeah, the challenge still, the motivation. They've done a lot, helped a lot, but there also remains the biggest challenge, I think.
Einar Tangen, what are your views on where this model that China has used, where this model could be used in other parts of the world? I mean, can it be done in places where there are very different political systems for one, countries with different population groups as well?
Not very easily. I mean, one of the advantages that China has is that they have very long-term, consistent planning. I mean, you're hearing about the 5-year plan, the 2035, the 2050 plan. This poverty eradication effort was 8 years, quote, in the making under Xi Jinping. But the fact is, it goes back to Deng Xiaoping in terms of turning China around economically. Now, I mean, let's not gloss over one thing. I would like to add that, there were almost 10 million people who were relocated from areas that were not sustainable. These were areas where it did not make sense to keep people in remote areas where they could not earn a living, and it was not, fiscally, sustainable to run a road, rails, and all the things necessary to improve people's lives. So this was a hard decision that had to be made. But in the end, these people, their lives are going to be improved. Contrast this with the Rust Belts that developed in Europe and in America, where instead of being proactive, governments have paid out literally trillions of dollars just to keep people in place where they cannot earn a living, just, quote, waiting for things to turn around.
Okay, more of our conversation about China's white paper on poverty alleviation right after this. Stay with us. You're watching The Heat.
From a national psyche point of view, there was a bit of panic. oh, these things don't come and kill us all.
डर क्या बीमारी के डर है काम धंधे के तलाश में पैसे फंसे हुए हैं
There's something real comforting about knowing you're going out to help people.
Che hanno maggior criticità sanitaria andranno al collasso, purtroppo vedremo tante persone morire.
当时武汉那个情况，你说你躲到哪里去？你就没有地方躲，你还不如勇敢一点，做一点力所能及的事。
Facing the unknown is always difficult. In a world in turmoil, it's easy to lose orientation. But when the storms come, we have to see the possibilities, reinvent, find new opportunities, discover a path forward. CGTN, see the difference.
Welcome back to The Heat. China accounts for nearly 1/5 of the world's population, and yet the country was able to declare a, quote, complete victory in eradicating absolute poverty in 2020. On Tuesday, China released a white paper to share not only its accomplishment, but provide information on how other countries can follow its example. Let's get back to our panel right now. And Liang, I'd like to start with you for this part of the show. This is not the first time other countries have tried to alleviate poverty. They have tried other systems. About 2 years ago, India proposed the concept of universal basic income, where every family would get a certain sum of money every week or every month on which to live on. How different was the Chinese approach?
I think China's approach is much more comprehensive than just giving basic income to people. What China has done, as the previous speakers have talked about, this is a whole mobilization at all levels of the government. The central government has provided a lot of funding. We know that according to the Ministry of Finance, they spent about $150 billion on poverty relief programs in just the last 3 years. So there's a huge effort in terms of financial resources that China was able to afford and prioritize into these poverty relief programs. And in addition to that, I think the government has invested in many infrastructure projects and building the roads, make sure the electric grid are installed, provide basic water coverage. Tap waters now cover about 83% of the rural population, and also providing education. So it's a whole list of infrastructure and opportunities rather than just basic income. And furthermore, I think the government has also sent a lot of talents to the rural area to really monitor the process. The local government officials, for example, would actually go into those poor counties, identify the impoverished population, and check on them on a weekly basis for the progress. In addition to that, there are a lot of efforts in training, education, job creation. So I think China's approach is much more comprehensive and sustainable in that regard.
Ambassador Jorge Heine, what kind of ripple effect will China's success have on the global economy? And I'm thinking especially of countries in the developing world, in countries in Africa, for instance, or in Latin America, where China, we know, is deeply involved in infrastructure development.
Of course. Well, there are several things here. One very important thing, it seems to me, is that we will see is an increased demand for food from China and other sort of basic goods that can be provided by countries in Latin America and in Africa. That's one thing. The more China grows, the more demand there is for what we produce. So that's one thing. The other thing is obviously the infrastructure needs in Latin America, in Africa, are extremely significant. And I've been emphasizing this quite a bit. And I would like to see that what has happened in China now will make governments and decision makers come to the senses and realize how significant connectivity is. I would argue that an important part of China's success, both in its economic growth and its poverty alleviation, derives from connectivity, from infrastructure, from digital connectivity. That is very important. And if I may add on something on the previous questions, what I've been impressed by is how this poverty alleviation program is really a whole of government effort. It is not just one or two agencies, one or two ministries, but it's all across the board. And for example, there is a place for cash transfers, which is important and have been tried elsewhere, including in South America. But this goes hand in hand with, for example, small loans for business and business initiatives, even in some cases to expedite IPOs in particular areas where poverty is high. So I find this very important because it is an across-the-board effort rather than by one or two agencies, as sometimes happens.
Li Gan, if we look at China right now, per capita income is $10,000, but it wants to realize what it calls socialist modernization by 2035. You talked a moment ago about some of the challenges it will face on the way to that accomplishment. But as Liang pointed out at the beginning of the show, is there a risk that China could fall victim to what we know as the middle income trap?
That's a good question. I think not. I believe not. So my research and many of the people in China has a golden opportunity for next 10, 15 years. I call it no-hanging fruit. They have a very good way of keep moving, keep developing, keep growing in a reasonably good pace. The low-hanging fruit, which I call it, is transfers. So we talked about China has spent lots of money in terms of helping the extreme poor, very successful and a great achievement. But in general, in the bigger picture, which China talks about relative poverty, China has not spent nearly as much money in terms of transfer to the relative poor. To the extreme poor, yes, they have done that, and it's fantastic. For the relative poor, which is not, we're not talking about 2% of the population, we're talking about 10, 15, or 20% of the population, China has not done much. And those people actually have very high, they like to consume. So China, in order for China to leap out of this poverty trap, the only thing China, I believe China needs to do or has to do is to domestic consumption, to stimulate, to encourage domestic consumption. And by doing that, the way to do that is large-scale increasing transfer to the poor. And how to do that? I've been saying that is one possibility, and I think it's a real possibility. Is I call negative income tax. Just truly for a relatively larger scale, transfer money to the relative poor. You can do this in the we call incentive compatible way, encourage working, encouraging education, encouraging health, investment, etc. But that can be done, and that should be done. And I think by doing that, those people will consume because they often consume a much larger percentage of the income. So overall, I think the consumption will grow, and the consumption as a percentage of the GDP will grow faster than the GDP growth. And then I think China will have another 20 years of pretty good growth, no poverty trap, no middle income trap, I'm saying.
Right. Einar Tangen, what is your view on the challenges ahead? And the focus has been, relatively speaking, mostly in rural parts of China. I mean, do you see a shift of the focus from the rural parts of China to the urban areas?
Not yet. I mean, there's certainly an urban-rural divide. It has to be addressed. China has indicated that this is a major priority. And they have this rural revitalization plan, which is going to replace this poverty reduction. But, you know, what you have here is the first example of somebody actually doing something. It's like climbing Mount Everest. I don't know if I can do it, but then somebody does it. And they say, well, if they can do it, I can do it. In terms of China's future, I would say that it's more about efficiency than anything else. China has to import a tremendous amount of resources from around the world, and then in order to pay for them, they need to add value and ship at least a portion of those out, enough so that their balance of payments remains strong. But China does not want to fall into this trap where it starts raising incomes, but is not able to provide value. They don't want to lose that edge. So the only real alternative is to be much more efficient. And you see this using the internet to lower costs so that consumers at the end of the day have more money in their pocket because they didn't have to spend as much on many of these items. And you see this across the board.
Yeah, and Liang, of course, getting people out of poverty is one thing, but as Ambassador Jorge Heine pointed out a moment ago, it wasn't just one ministry or department or one group of people in China that got this done. It was across a lot of ministries, a lot of sectors. But to what extent will this achievement that China has got to right now have to be accompanied by also improvements in things like education, healthcare, and job creation?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that goes back to what Professor Li was talking about, the so-called moderate poverty, which defined by population that live under $5.50 per day, and 1/4 of Chinese population meet that standard. So the next step after eradicating poverty is really to boost income for all these large portion of the population. And the key, I think, as some of the speakers have mentioned, is upgrading skill sets, trying to improve efficiency, because in the past, China was able to rely on low labor cost and engage in, labor-intensive manufacturing goods to lift people out of poverty. But that is going to be unlikely going forward as China's wages rises, and that require upgrading skill sets, and improving efficiency and upgrading value added in manufacturing and services. So I think that is a challenge and an opportunity for China to sort of escape the so-called middle income trap. And it does take a lot of efforts, not only at the rural area, but also at the urban area, with technological advancements, with infrastructure upgrading, etc. So I do think that I share with the sentiment that China has a lot of opportunities and also challenges ahead. One last thing that I want to add is I think China's growth and poverty eradication is not only providing demand for the rest of the world, but China has been actively investing, lending, and providing debt relief and suspension to many countries. According to a new World Bank report, the Belt and Road Initiative was projected to lift 7.6 million people out of extreme poverty and 32 million out of moderate poverty. So I think China is providing a lot of opportunities for the world as well.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. That is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arland Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.